Today's show is sponsored by Datadog, a scalable, full-stack monitoring platform. Datadog synthetic monitoring enables you to detect front-end errors and performance errors by analyzing user sessions and receiving actionable alerts. API tests help you detect and debug user-facing issues in critical endpoints and applications. Build and deploy self-maintaining browser tests to simulate user journeys from global locations. Start proactively monitoring your user experience today with a free 14-day trial of Datadog by visiting datadog.com/frontend-cloudcast. That's datadog.com/frontend-cloudcast.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And it is Aaron for Cloud News this week. And just a quick update. I was actually at Red Hat Summit last week. So first time at a Red Hat Summit and actually first time in Boston for an event. So I'll do a quick recap of that almost as like a news story here. And then we'll hit a couple news articles and we'll get on to a really fantastic interview after the break. First of all, Red Hat Summit. Red Hat Summit, it was really nice to do a show of that size. And also really good crowds, really good announcements. I was really impressed with the quality of the event and actually overall impressed by Boston. Like I said, I'd never done an event in Boston before. And it was a little cold, but a really good event. And it certainly met up with a lot of folks and a lot of folks I hadn't seen in a number of years and really look forward to getting to the next Red Hat Summit. Now, from a news article standpoint, it was a bit of a slow week though, but NVIDIA, following on from, if you hadn't seen, they did some really amazing results and their stock popped really nicely on top of that. And so they doubled down and on Monday decided to announce more offerings. So the first thing was almost like a supercomputer, AI supercomputer platform, they're calling it. And NVIDIA, unfortunately, they're not very well known for their names. It's the DGX GH200. Yeah, that's the name. But it uses NVIDIA NVLink and can combine up to 256 NVIDIA GH200 superchips into a single data center-sized GPU. So monster GPU chips, the size of a data center, are here. And that was one thing. Another one was, this is part of the Mellanox acquisition they did a couple years ago, but NVIDIA Spectrum X. So a new networking system. They didn't really announce a lot of details around it. But of course, with these big super chips and AI data centers now, well, guess what? We're moving a lot of data. So the AI bottlenecks is probably the speed of the network at this point. So faster is better when it comes to the networks. And then lastly, this is for all the gamers out there. They announced ACE, Avatar Cloud Engine, which anybody who plays computer games, a lot of times there's NPCs, the non-player characters. You talk to them, they typically have a dialogue tree and pretty canned responses that they reply back. It's usually pretty boring. Well, this one will take those NPCs, take the text you put into them, put it into a generative AI program, and kick back responses. So it'll be interesting to see if this gets adopted or not, and how and what they decide to do with it in the industry going forward. And one more thing to talk about. Microsoft launched Fabric, so a new end-to-end data analytics platform. And this is kind of a combination of a bunch of services. You think of it as Microsoft OneLake, so their data lake product, and then you can actually bring in data from Amazon and Google Cloud as well. And then packaging all of the other services like Data Factory and Power BI and Data Activator all into one big consumable experience. So making this data platform something more consumable, if you will, in the era of AI. So that is something else that was announced last week. So with that, I'm going to wrap up Cloud News for this week. And coming up right after the break, we're going to be talking about OSS and WebAssembly in the public cloud with our friends Bridget and Ralph from Microsoft.
Are you getting pressure from finance to justify or reduce your cloud bill? Cloud Zero is the only cloud cost platform loved by engineers and trusted by finance. Cloud Zero can identify unused, idle, or over-provisioned resources, alert you to spend anomalies, and organize 100% of your spend into a framework that mirrors your business structure, like cost per customer, product feature, or team. It's the most powerful platform ever built to provide accurate, granular visibility into your total cloud spend without the typical pitfalls of legacy cloud cost management tools like endless tagging or clunky Kubernetes support. Manage cost, optimize development, and maximize profit, all in one platform. Join companies like Rapid7, Drift, and SeatGeek by visiting cloudzero.com/cloudcast to get started. That's cloudzero.com/cloudcast. Visit today to experience immediate and ongoing savings on your cloud bill. And we're back. And Aaron, you and I have both been traveling a bit, but it's good to be back together doing the show again. How are you?
I'm good. And as we're recording this, it is a little bit post-KubeCon, and I think everyone's recovered, but I think we'll even talk about that a little bit today.
Yeah, absolutely. So today, we're going to dive into a topic that I know is, kind of covers a whole lot of things. We're going to cover a little bit about kind of the broader cloud world. We're going to cover a little bit about open source. We're going to cover a little bit about what's going on in the new ways of building applications and development. And really, really excited to have two folks that are going to give us just a ton of insight, longtime friends of the show. So really, really excited to have both Bridget Kromhout as well as Ralph Squillace, both of them from Azure. So Ralph and Bridget, welcome to the show. Great to have you both on. And Bridget, great to have you back. It's been a very long time since we sat on the floor at either a DockerCon or a KubeCon and recorded one a long time ago. So great to have you both back on the show.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
I actually was thinking about that. I went back and I listened to our show from fall 2015. We were sitting on the floor at reInvent, and we thought we found a quiet corner, and then keynotes let out and descended upon us.
I forgot all about. Yeah, I remember I distinctly remember having the gear and sitting on the floor. It was like at the end of the hall, and then it turns out the end of the hall was where the doors open and the keynote lets out.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
So when I saw that you put in the notes that, we last talked 7 years ago, I thought, wait, no, that's not right. And then I realized, yes, that was fall 2015. It was right after I switched from 15 years of ops to DevRel. Did that for 4 years. Then I moved to product, where I've worked in cloud native open source upstream for 3 years. And that brings us to now, which is 7 somehow. Like, I used to tell stories about software, and now I help write the stories, and an unconscionable amount of time has passed.
Yeah, we're gonna get into all that. So, Bridget, thank you for that. Ralph, you have not yet, unfortunately, not yet been a guest of the show, but welcome to the family. Welcome to the community.
I'm thrilled to be here.
Give folks a little bit about your background, and then maybe more importantly, what you're focusing on these days over at Microsoft.
Okay, well, technically, I'm old, which you may or may not be.
That's okay. We're all there.
It's certainly catching up. All right, I'm catching up with my dad and all that stuff. No, I'm a principal program manager at Azure Core Upstream. But the old part means that I've been around the industry for quite some time. The real joy is I actually report to Bridget, which I love doing. And in most of my day work, I do basically right now, I do sort of a little bit of Azure Container Registry. So some of that stuff on the service side, but most of my day is spent working in the WebAssembly community and supporting the growth of that ecosystem and trying to think about like how developers use it, how people operate with it, and so forth. But I go way back. This is going to hurt me, and so I'm open for mockery. I lived through the W-Star, SOAP, web services, early SOA stuff. And before that, I was, and this is going to hurt more, I was com.net. And even before that, I started in OLE 32, which is a Windows thing that if you're really old, you might know, but it's like, that was Corba. If you're a Java person, you might, So there's a lot of pain under the bridge.
But there's also a through line there, right? Because now you're in WebAssembly, which is hey, we can actually not worry about all of those different pieces anymore. There was so much worry about, it has to run in this. And now you're thinking, wait a minute.
Yep.
Yeah, we'll get there. I'm sure. I know that I'm going to be tortured, and I'm happy for that. But it's been a long time, and I've touched a whole bunch of things.
Well, and Ralph, I can't pass up this dig. So my experience with Ole 32 was when I was, in college as a computer science major.
Right.
So that ages both of us probably, but still.
Yeah. Worse, I was already there when you were in college as a CS. And so that, hey. But yeah, I go way back, and I've worked in a lot of places at Microsoft. I quit once when I didn't like really the direction the company was going. I came back to do Linux early on at Microsoft. So there's a lot of stuff I've touched in the past 25 years.
Fantastic. Well, so first off, Bridget, let's catch up a little bit. So when we last spoke, you were involved in the Arrested DevOps podcast, and that was going. And then I kind of noticed it tailed off a little bit here lately, right? And then you're still involved in DevOps days. And so how are things going there, first of all?
Sure, absolutely. So in terms of Arrested DevOps, I'm definitely more of a podcast guest than host these days, just because my focus being moving from DevRel to product means I don't really have a day job that makes sense to do as much in the way of podcasting. So I would say the skill that I took away from that I still use pretty frequently is I moderate the occasional panel. Like say I got pulled in last minute because of somebody not being able to travel to moderate the code of conduct panel at KubeCon. So that's just kind of like, keep those skills up, but it's not something, running the podcast conversations is not something I do regularly anymore.
And that dovetails into, like, I was going to ask a follow-up on that is like, your career has changed a bit. You already mentioned it, like developer advocate over into product management side. So tell everyone a little bit about that and that experience real quick.
Absolutely. So, sorry, I thought Brian was about to say something.
No, I was going to follow up on Aaron. I mean, that's a career path, or at least a career arc that people are super interested in. Yeah. So, jump in.
Yeah. So this actually ties into, I think, the question that you asked a minute ago about DevOps days as well, which is I came out of an ops background, and then I started kind of talking to customers and helping with those commonalities around IT transformation and getting better at operating our systems, operating our software. And that fit really well with the DevOps Days conversation. So I actually led the DevOps Days org from 2015 to 2020. And we can talk a little bit about the fun scaling lessons from that. Scaling human systems is very similar to scaling large-scale computer systems. But when I went to Microsoft, also still in a DevRel capacity, and then realized that I was spending all my time with these developers and PMs on the team that Ralph was actually already attached to, and telling their stories, and then started kind of getting involved in making sure their releases went well and making sure that we had everything planned the way we wanted to, and making sure we were telling the story to ourselves of how we were going to build it. And so it was a very logical transformation to just move into the product facing side of this open source work, instead of I was more focused on telling stories about it. And then I started, creating those stories. So.
Yeah. Does it grow out of, and I'm sure everybody's journey is a little bit different, but does it grow out of sort of maybe a frustration to a certain extent of like, hey, I keep telling you product managers, this is what people want, and maybe they didn't hear you or they weren't doing it, or have you kind of gained a new appreciation for, one of the great challenges of product management is you get lots of great ideas and lots of great inputs, but you have a finite amount of resources to deal with. Do you now have a different perspective of, rationalization and prioritizing things and kind of compassion for that stuff? Or is it, what's been the learning progress as you've gone from one role to another?
I think, and this is something I would love to hear what Ralph thinks as well, but I think that every role you can have your localized concerns, and then the places, the touch points, the places where you intersect with other roles are either going to be full of friction or hopefully well connected in terms of understanding of each other's constraints. And so I think one of the functions of PM that's pretty useful is you're talking to first party and third party users of the software. You're talking to the developer teams that are creating the software. And you're at least hopefully trying to make sure that what we're building is going to meet the needs that exist, as well as being like the thing that we want to build. It's got to be the thing people need, because otherwise we're just building software people aren't going to use. But I'm curious what you think of that, Ralph.
Well, I was thinking as I was listening to you, I was reflecting on the fact that I was, in the group before you arrived, right? Mm-hmm. And throughout, and I've been at Microsoft twice. I've run myself as a business for, I've been in a lot of different positions and so forth. One of the things that's fascinating is over the last 20 or 30 years, for example, people thought of themselves as engineers or developers. And so the software was, and that means product, or did mean product. And now it really means software. The idea was that somehow you were building your thing, right? And that was the important stuff. One of the best aspects of, in my view, of DevOps as a kind of a concept, an idea, however vague or varied you might, define it yourself in some sense, was the idea that the ongoing operations were intimately tied with the value of the software itself, which is a very, very different view from product, right? And the thing that you brought to our team, which was happening anyway, was this sense that the real value for users was the ability to continue using it. And that meant bringing operations and development together in the sort of classic DevOps way. And one of the big impacts you had, and I haven't really articulated this to you before, so now I need to buy you a gift or something, was that the ongoing operations were a critical part of the software, whether it's some service or whether it's an open source project. You have to keep being able to run it. And that is sort of the SRE mindset, if not always the technique. And that part of that integration between what you're supposed to deliver and what people want is the step 2 or day 2 or whatever phrase you might use. It's the ongoing operational aspect of its ease of use. And that part, Bridget has just, had incredible influence in our group and across certain parts of Azure.
And what's fascinating to me as well is, like, as you're having this conversation, it just occurred to me, we have this whole, idea of folks with a very heavy DevOps background getting into product management, and then what happens?
Yeah. So the funniest thing is there are companies, big companies who shall remain nameless, who have a history of focusing unduly on the first day use, right? That oh, hey, you can set it up easy, you can get the whole world working easily. And it turns out that's not really the value of the software, no matter what you think. And that is the other lessons that DevOps, I think, and SRE sort of definitely have the core nugget of truth there, and yet it's not really expressed that way often.
Yeah.
I gave in my DevRel focus at Microsoft before I moved over to the product org, I gave I went and counted them. I gave 11 3-hour Kubernetes workshops based on Jerome Petazzoni's container.training, excellent site. Mm-hmm. Around the world, just like one almost every month in 2018. And this is to hundreds of people. And they're all trying to just get started, just get over that. I would like to figure out what it's like to interact with Kubernetes. Again, this is 2018, so a lot of them had never tried it. And that's a getting started thing, which is great. But then there's the scaling up thing. And that comes back to the DevOps days. I went back and I looked and I saw that we had about 20 events a year when I took over running the organization in 2015. In 2016, that had doubled. By 2019, at the pre-pandemic era peak, it was up to 80 a year. And that doesn't mean that many more cities had people that wanted to do, DevOps conferences. They probably already wanted to. but we wrote documentation. And you can see in the graph the difference when you've scaled up your impact by automation and documentation. Those are, I think, the PM role is very much a facilitator role, because we should make it possible to do this at scale. Someone has a great idea and they can do it once. That's fantastic. Can you do it 800,000 times for 3 years? Because that's what actual reality needs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Well,
and
if you talk about having 88 or so DevOps days. I mean, KubeCon just got done, 10,000 people, but 60% of them they said were first time to CNCF. So that number doesn't sound like it's going to be slowing down anytime soon, which is a problem, but also I guess a good problem for all of us that are sort of in this industry, in terms of people wondering like, oh, okay, right, we're now at this sort of phase where people are like, oh, is the cloud native stuff like it's an old fad, and maybe AI is just going to take over everything. So yeah, good to hear that sort of stuff is still expanding, because it does still feel like, I mean, it's only been, seven years since we had that first conversation, but it's still really early days.
Yeah, I want to jump in really quickly, because it's not just that the industry, cloud native industry, as a sort of a métier. I don't know. I can't come up with the English word right now, but basically that it's not just that industry is still strong. It's that the skills that we're starting to talk about here are actually affecting other industries that are not cloud native. So software engineering is expanding radically, and cloud native is part of bringing some of the best practices to places that haven't been cloud native before. And so it's both expansions are still happening, which is amazing.
Yep. Agreed.
Oh, and to your point about, of course, KubeCon was enormous, but also CNCF talked somewhat at KubeCon about they're not only continuing on with the Kubernetes community days, which are very much modeled after DevOps days. They actually talked to me when they were originally launching those, and got some Jennifer Davis and other members of the DevOps days core team to kind of help them get that off the ground. But they also are doing now some Cube days, which are, again, kind of a scaled down, distributed out. You can't necessarily run a KubeCon in every city around the world, but you can run, or in every geo, but you can run smaller events to kind of give people a chance to participating at a more local level.
So actually, that's a good segue into the next thing I wanted to talk about. So we're talking about CNCF and just open source software in general, right? There's been a good bit of commitment and involvement by Azure, and I don't know that necessarily everyone realizes that out there, right? And so for those that aren't familiar, tell everyone a little bit about open source software at Azure, and how does Microsoft and the Azure teams work with the Linux Foundation or the CNCF, for instance?
Sure. So I'm going to look to Ralph for him to talk a little bit about some of the foundation work, just because, as you may have realized, there is the Linux Foundation, and there's also a lot of other things going on that aren't just CNCF. So we should talk about that a little bit. But in terms of our involvement with open source software, I think we've all seen that XKCD with, the entirety of modern infrastructure is built on one guy in Nebraska or wherever who is writing the one piece of code that keeps everyone alive. And I think that as a corporate entity that relies heavily on open source software, Microsoft quite reasonably asserts that we should spend developer time, PM time, time and money and effort to make sure that open source software remains a good foundation for our work and is not just one sad guy in Nebraska. So we actually invest pretty heavily in it. We're one of the, if you can go look at the open source program office, there'll be a link in the show notes, I believe, where there's a lot of details and data, and we don't need to necessarily go into that, but basically Microsoft employees on the employer time and dime contribute a great deal of work to open source software as a matter of corporate strategy. And it's not at all secret. It's actually very useful to us. So it's just because of historical statements made in the past by leadership, I think people maybe find it surprising, but we're very far. Satya Nadella is very far from the, Linux is cancer era.
Yeah, I think the thing that, and we've talked about this a little bit on the show before, I think at some point, Microsoft and we've praised Satya like crazy, probably should be in the top 3 or 5 technology leaders of all time. But I think I feel like the thing that Microsoft eventually realized was their world at one point was we have an operating system and everything can live on top of that, and you can build all sorts of things, and they at some point unhinged them, kind of unhooked their brain from it has to be our owned operating system in order to create all these computing technology things that can happen and do all sorts of amazing things. And now it feels like they've embraced this idea of like people are going to do computing in all sorts of ways, and it might be called gaming, and it might be called a Java application, it might be called something else, that we need to be relevant in all of those places, because in the past we were relevant in all those places. Like that feels like once they were able to sort of unhook their brain from like it can only happen on Windows, being a contributor to Linux and all things open source is just that next generation of what kind of an operating system enables for all this stuff.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, like briefly, I think before we were chatting, I had quit the company at one point in the early 2000s after the .com crash because things didn't feel like they were going the way that I believed was a good thing. And so even though I'm back at the company, and I came back because the direction of the company had changed, and I thought that was a good thing to do. The real truth is you expressed it really, really well. There was a realization that a certain epoch of economic stability for the company based on one model, right, was not something that could last forever. And that's true for every company. This weird system we live in, on this planet is a system of change. And so you have to change with it. The one thing that you point out, and I would say it slightly differently, but it's really the same thing, which is that Microsoft, by and large, really realized that computing software and individual developers were the things that really mattered, and it didn't matter where they were. And that change is partly like, for example, why we're involved in all those foundations. So, and there are tons. The Linux Foundation is obviously one. I'm a co-founder of the Bytecode Alliance Foundation, was WebAssembly stuff, and we can talk about that later. But we're also in OSSF. We're in the Confidential Computing Consortium. Pretty much every foundation, and part of that work does, in fact, involve paying for the infrastructure we don't use. We have to lose in order that everybody can win.
Or the infrastructure we do use.
Well, no. In fact, the thing is that it's all one big web of people building software, and so the expectation that the rewards come back to us are often not only not direct. It's hard to even see them sometimes, but it's the entire network of people being creative on their own time. So we acquired Deus. About 7 years back, and they did some wonderful things, but among them were a core group of maintainers for Helm, for example. Microsoft continues to foot the bill for, in just using this one example, continues to foot the bill for the operational infrastructure, downloading infrastructure, and everything for Helm. But we don't have those members anymore in the maintainer. We don't have Helm maintainership, and we continue to pay. That is critical support for everybody doing work, in addition to people who might actually use Azure one day when they forget who they are, that kind of thing. Yeah. So all of that stuff happens.
No, and you highlight something that is one of those, like, it's not a dirty secret of our industry, right? It's not like somebody, but it's just a reality of our industry. I remember, and you're really just highlighting the fact that, there is a ton of infrastructure that happens to run in Azure Cloud, or it runs in GitHub, it runs in Google Cloud, that allows all these foundations and open source groups to be able to just do basic things like testing and run their CI/CD pipelines.
Yeah, that stuff
that people forget about. Like, they're just like, oh yeah, we'll just get it. I remember at one point I was sitting on a street corner with Dan Kahn in the early days of the CNCF, and he was like, and this isn't a knock on Google, but he was like, yeah, there's some concern that the Google folks may not keep, hosting the infrastructure for Kubernetes. And you were like, well, but they just always have. Like, it was just this, we
Yeah.
kind of unconsciously made this assumption. Well, you started it, you just have to keep running it. And, and it's the reality. It's, it's kind of why like Docker, stopped doing their sort of free plan for certain stuff. Like at some point, economics and free software will clash with each other. And there's just a reality there, whether it's perceived as good or bad or whatever. But yeah, I mean, you highlight something it's important that some entities step up and do that may not always be, the most, beneficial to their specific bottom line, but there hopefully is a bigger picture to it.
Yeah, and there has to be. So there are even more examples. So for example, that story about Dan and Google maybe one day not pumping as much money into it, that actually has happened. So the shift to the registry domain is precisely because those costs were massive on the part of Google. That's not a knock on Google for not paying. What a great gift to the world to have paid for all that stuff for so long. And then the people who are stepping up, our donations and contributions being some of them, but everybody else who benefits from that is stepping up to help make the transition something that's possible. And that continues supporting the entire ecosystem for everybody. It doesn't matter whether you're paying or not paying, you get to use it. So it's a really a great thing on Google's part for having not only supported it for that long, but also everybody else for sitting there and going, you know what, we need to support it too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I know we want to get to WebAssembly, but before we move off of Kubernetes, I do want to point out something else related to this, which is a lot of times people say, oh, Kubernetes now has this. And they think, if they think about it at all, they think, oh, well, maybe Google decided to put it in there, or I don't know, some Kubernetes committee. A lot of times it is individual people who say, hey, our customers, for in one example, and I put a link in the notes to it, is our customers at Azure had been saying for some years, we really need IPv6 support in Kubernetes. And that's a lot of work, but understatement. But it took about 5 years to get that into Kubernetes. And there were people from Google, people from Red Hat, people from Microsoft working on it. And the vast majority of the code to get it across the line was actually written by Cal Henedak at Microsoft and reviewed by Tim Hawken at Google. And Antonio Ueja, who I think was at Red Hat at the time, but is at Google now. And these are just a few people doing something enormous that ends up having a huge impact. And at the same time, they're doing it because they're working for vendors that are paying them to work on this as their full-time job, which I think is very important because there would not be IPv6 support in Kubernetes today if somebody had to write it after work on their spare time. That's just not possible. So I think it's important to remember that corporations have to put the money in to make that happen.
At scale. I mean, we have to even remember that Linus was supported by companies throughout his career in order to make it possible for what we take to be this beautiful Linux ecosystem reach the heights that it's reached today. That was all corporate support all through all those years as well. And it would be almost impossible to imagine somebody would say, well, that shouldn't have happened.
Yeah. I want to shift gears a little bit, but kind of stick with this theme of dealing with stuff, over time and at scale. Ralph, when we started the introduction, you sort of gave us a history of all the different ways of interacting with computing that you've done over your career. You're now focused on WebAssembly, which to a certain extent feels like maybe the next logical step. We've seen it on the development side, lots of different things. And then Java kind of came along and became this run anywhere kind of sort of panacea. And it's gone through lots of iterations. We've seen people go from building things in VMs to building them in containers to talking about serverless. We've always got this iteration of, smaller, more flexible, whatever it might be. Kind of help us as somebody who has seen a lot of things. Where do you see WebAssembly kind of fitting in the spectrum of what, not just where we are, but what we've learned over the last 5 years, 10 years?
Well, I'm going to give you two pitches right away. I'll give you the silver bullet pitch, and then I'll give you the engineer pitch.
Sure.
So the silver bullet pitch is WebAssembly really is the cloud native binary that's going to take cloud native everywhere in the world. It's amazing. You'll always want it plus peanut butter and jam, right? Like that'll be it. That's the happy, pie in the sky kind of thing. There's a certain aspect of that which is really potentially true, but when we talk about a certain aspect, the engineer voice walks in, and the engineer voice says, "Wait a minute, did we ever actually get rid of VMs, or is it the foundation of the technology that we run in cloud native?" And the answer is, it's actually the foundation. So did we circumvent that with containers? No, we actually run containers on the VMs. It's amazing and it's really cool. They work together. And so when you get to things like WebAssembly, where you really, the easy phrase is it's a cloud native binary kind of thing rather than a cloud native environment like a container where it's, you got a whole OS and a file system and stuff like that. You realize that any engineer in the world would sit there and go, okay, wait, we're going to use this because it's better in certain areas while we continue using containers and continue using VMs. So one should realize that the evolution through all these technologies, as an engineer, you choose the one that fits the circumstance you want. And WebAssembly is just going to give us new features. And that's really the way to think about it, that we can use where the other technologies don't necessarily give us those features. But because the other stuff already runs, you ain't going to touch it. Don't fix it if it ain't broke. So that's the sort of high order bit. Where do you want to go from there?
Well, I'll ask 2 rapid fire questions, compare and contrast questions, if you will.
Sure.
So let's compare and contrast to Azure Functions, question 1, and then compare and contrast to past promises of PaaS.
Right. Okay. Actually, to be quite honest, well, let's see. No, the Azure Functions one is a more specific, it's a service kind of thing. So I'll tackle that one. Azure Functions is a service for PaaS serverless, right? That's what it is. So if you've used it, you can give us some native code, and you can think of other similar function models, Lambda or whatever Google's got, which I admit I don't know. The point here is it doesn't matter, because these are services where you give them some native code and they handle that distribution for you, and it's event driven, and you don't have to think about servers. And then of course we always say, but remember, there are servers under the covers. There's really nothing specific to that. It's native, or it can take a container now, just like all the other function models, serviceless models. And so the question is really, if it's native when it executes, or it takes a container, could it also take a WebAssembly? And then now you know where the relationship between WebAssembly, containers, and native code relative to the actual service that does the UX, right? Does the sort of the provisioning and the scaling and all that stuff that you don't, in theory, have to think about. WebAssembly is just another way to package your code and deliver it so it can be executed. The only difference there is WebAssembly has, as a technology, its own ability to do the same thing outside of Azure Functions. For example, a lot of my work, my team's work, is in connecting it to Kubernetes. So you can think of it as another kind of container. It just brings you different features. It's faster, smaller. You can run across different nodes and OSs and architectures, and you don't have to really even think about it. So that makes it's easy to think that WebAssembly is the cool thing there. But in reality, what you're going to end up feeling is that Kubernetes can do more. Like, it's Kubernetes power that expands because it's adding the feature set of WebAssembly. And when you ask about Azure Functions or any other serverless PaaS like that, all WebAssembly is doing is adding the same feature set to that as well. Does that get at what you're going for?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So then the second question was just, how does this change PaaSes generally? And I think that you can probably see where I'm going to go. There's a set of features you get with WebAssembly, and I'm sure you've heard them. And if you haven't, it's basically default security. You can't do anything without the host agreeing that you can do it, which is opposite of containers, which is great, he said, breathing heavily. The other one is size and speed. So it can start in, actually, if you strip away the networking and stuff, you can start it in nanoseconds from cold, which if you've used the PaaSes, that is basically, cold start is one of the complaints pretty much every PaaS currently implemented has. So it brings you a feature there. You can start something super fast, even in Kubernetes, which is one of those things where, hey, the gearing is pretty heavy, and yet you can still get kind of bouncy in there. And the other one is portability, right? You can compile to WebAssembly from any number of languages and any number of runtimes. Also, you don't have just one runtime. So both sets have a really rich ecosystem with tons of open source solutions that you can choose. And you don't have to get rid of your containers. You can keep running your containers. So the effect of WebAssembly is to bring that feature set to the paths you're already using. So things can be faster at cold start. Things can be smaller to deploy, and you still get immutable, and you're really only deploying your code path, not an entire environment.
Interesting. What having worked on it for a little while now, do you see any parallels in terms of, like if you were just listening to this and you took the word WebAssembly or the words WebAssembly out of it, like some people might go, oh, sounds a lot like what we heard with Java or whatever. Have you seen certain learnings that have been like, oh, we're not going to make that same mistake, or we're not going to create that same situation that will make things better for people than, some of these sort of quote unquote silver bullets we've seen in the past?
Yeah, it's true. Bridget, you were raising your hand. Were you going to jump in there for a sec?
Oh, no, I was thinking, I agree with everything Ralph is saying. And also I think there's a slight distinction between, your orchestrator and runtime. And so it's very simple, I think, for people to say, oh, now we have this. And it's like, yeah, and also we still have this over there for these purposes. And that's some of the work Ralph is doing with connecting WebAssembly to Kubernetes, because cool, you have some WebAssembly. Exactly how do you operationalize this?
Yeah. So this actually feeds back into your question, which is sort of like, what did we learn that we don't want to do as much as we learned that we can do more, kind of thing. And in fact, the whole ecosystem is thinking about exactly how these areas should evolve. As you can imagine, there's tons of companies, tons of people devoting their time to getting things working, no matter where you are, whether it's in the orchestration space or stuff. Like I could rattle off any number of people who are paying money for infrastructure uses and so forth on the kind of the pure capitalist side. And I can tell you any number of people who are devoting their private weekends to doing work because they think it's cool and they want to use it themselves as well. But there are a couple of high order bits. One is, if you overly focus on the word WebAssembly, much the way we often spent time focusing on containers, you miss that you're really after features. And so there are places where WebAssembly makes no sense. WebAssembly doesn't have a threading model yet. It sort of does now have an early one. There's no GC, which is coming. Like all these things are coming and you're going to get them, but you're still not going to build some Apache style web server or PostgreSQL in WebAssembly and think you're going to run it at scale, right? Like that. We do that in containers, and even that was probably not necessarily is always the best choice. Really, those things run great in VMs, high failover, and they've been doing so for 30 years, and probably you should still do that, right? So the one thing we want to focus on, I think it's important to focus on when the feature set of WebAssembly is useful to you, not WebAssembly. You don't care about WebAssembly, really. You just want to know what steps to take, to go through to get the feature set that you want. And the other feature sets of containers and these other technologies. So that's one thing. We don't focus on the word. We focus on the scenario for it. And that scenario is mainly right now fast-firing functions, which is why things like Cloudflare use it, or Shopify, or even Akamai now has a WebAssembly experimentation, and Shopify, which is a huge, or actually a much bigger company in the e-commerce space than most people realize. There's tons of use cases for the feature set, and that's the thing that we need to focus on. This is not a silver bullet for everything, because software isn't a silver bullet for everything. That's really the high order bit here.
Interesting.
Oh, and I should add that I added a link for the show notes to Spin that Fermion is developing. And last time there was a WebAssembly discussion on this podcast was when you had Matt Butcher in, who was one of our colleagues who went off to start this awesome startup that Ralph has been collaborating with a lot. And in terms of the zeitgeist and the excitement, Hey, tell us about the workshop at KubeCon, Ralph.
Oh yeah, and in fact, I'll tell you a couple more things. Is that one of the dividing lines is in fact, where do orchestrators of a certain kind make sense? For example, Fermyon, for example, really decided that Kubernetes was probably not the best operational, control plane for distributed apps, and certainly not PaaS. And so they focused on HashiCorp's Nomad, which is a great, in many ways, much simpler system to scale stuff out. And they built Fermyon Cloud. They have a great blog on how they built Fermyon Cloud with Nomad. So all of a sudden you've got orchestrators and schedulers coming back and stuff like, yeah, Bridget.
And side note on that, because this is hilarious. If you recollect when I spoke with you folks 7 years ago about the work I had been doing at Drama Fever, my manager at Drama Fever, the head of ops at Drama Fever, doing Docker in production in 2014, was Tim Gross, who now is a developer on Nomad.
There you go. And so, wow. and there's another small company, Cosmonic, that does WASM Cloud, and they use kind of Elixir style actor model for their, which creates as kind of a service mesh, an ambient mesh using NATs to communicate, and they can jump across network boundaries, do failover from one cloud to another. There's a whole bunch of people who are giving us slices of functionality that use different technologies. The critical thing is to figure out which scenario you have to choose those slices of technologies. The thing that underlines all of those is we're all believing that still the WebAssembly feature set brings us that cloud native binary, which allows us to do these new things. And that continues to be the amazing value of WebAssembly in scenarios where containers aren't working really well. And that's the critical dividing line that you're sort of trying to search for. When we got to KubeCon, what happened was, and it wasn't just that KubeCon felt amazing, which, by the way, was really one of the best KubeCons I've ever been to. The thing that happened is we thought we did a tutorial, and WASM Edge, the second state runtime, did a tutorial at, so there were 2 hour-and-a-half tutorials on WebAssembly, getting apps running at KubeCon. We thought we might have 60 people if we were lucky. And we ended up registering, at the time, there were more than 600 people registered for the one we did with Fermyon, using Spin, and also K3Ds as a deployment platform, and then also AKS, which supports WebAssembly components and Spin as well. So that was amazing. And after an hour and a half, there were still 300 people in the auditorium, still typing and leaving. And I don't know if you've done tutorials, it's really hard to have everything work perfectly such that they're still engaged at the end, because you have a certain number of people where their machine's weird, or, you forgot some instruction and that's specific to them. So that was huge. What was more amazing is that the following 2 days later on Friday, where everybody's tired, there were another 200 people at the WASM Edge second state tutorial. It was unheard of. There is really tremendous interest in making use and understanding how WebAssembly works alongside your containers, alongside your VMs.
Interesting stuff. Well, we could probably keep going on this for quite a while.
Yeah, excuse me. We're not done. You're going to run this for another 2 hours.
We're going for the
I should have warned you. Short podcast and Ralph.
I'm just warming up.
We're going to become the Joe Rogan show here pretty quickly, and we're going to become 2 or 3 hours.
Oh no. Does that mean we have to have Aaron Rodgers come on and talk for hours?
That's right. Elon Musk will be on.
If I may, very quickly, I also want to shout out a whole bunch of people in that ecosystem that are also contributing everywhere. VMware might be a surprising one. They've done some wonderful stuff with WASM workers there. They've also supported making certain language builds for WebAssembly, like Python and Ruby and so forth, available for people to use on a nightly basis. The members of the Bytecode Alliance, I haven't talked that much about it, but have all contributed just countless hours to making sure these kinds of things work. And WASM.io, which was a conference in March in Barcelona, was amazing. And I look forward to any number more of those again. the people who at the Python Software Foundation who are now doing nightly WASI builds. There are a couple of people from Red Hat, one person from Microsoft and so forth, but a bunch of people who did amazing work to get that working because there's no threads. So that little fork call in the middle of Python down there, you have to figure out what to do with that. And they have. Just all of these organizations, all of the people spending their time doing this, it cuts across a huge swath of the industry trying to do great things. I wanted to make sure I shouted out a whole bunch of those names, and I could go on for the other 2 hours.
Yeah, no, that's good stuff. Finding where people have passions, whether they're big or small, is important. It's good to call those folks out. And I think, as much as we've learned a ton of stuff here, I think we may have made a list of 5 or 6 more shows that we need to dig into. I mean, just the idea that maybe Kubernetes has gone from sort of, got quiet. It's sort of become stabilized and dull, and maybe it's going to be having to go through a whole new revival, how to work with WebAssembly.
Yeah, it's really
scheduler isn't right. Maybe, yeah.
It's really doing both. It's getting stabilized and dull where it needs to be, and growing where it wants to.
Yeah, absolutely.
And before we wrap, I should say that one of the biggest wow moments for me at KubeCon was actually at the Contributor Summit right before the event, where we got people in a room to talk about Kubernetes LTS, and it's been a long journey. And there was a working group in the past that didn't end up getting results, and it's being revived now. And some of my Azure colleagues, Rita Zhang, raised her hand and said, "We're doing this. Who's with us?" And all of the big players are. So
very cool.
There's that stability effort continues, as well as this innovation effort over in WebAssembly land. We get both.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Good stuff. Aaron, you want to wrap it up? Take us home?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Bridget, Ralph, thank you very much for your time this week. And on behalf of Brian and myself, thank you everyone for listening. And if you enjoy the show, please, wherever you get your podcasts, if you can leave a review, leave us a review. If you can, tell a friend as well. And that will wrap us for this week. And we will talk to everyone next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.